Greetings, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Industrial Packaging Podcast with me, your host, Nathan Dube, Digital Marketing Specialist at Industrial Packaging. On today's episode, we have special guest, Carman Pirie, co-founder of Kula Partners, one of the world's premier marketing agencies specifically for manufacturers. Carman, how you doing today?
I am doing amazing, Nathan. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a good day to be podcasting and discussing sustainability.
Yeah, I would say that is the case here as well. Look, here in Halifax, Nova Scotia today, it is a very, very snowy day. So nice to be quietly indoors, as it were.
I believe it. What a beautiful place. That's awesome that you live up there. I live probably about 12 to 20 hours south of you. I'm in central Massachusetts. We also have about 6 inches of snow outside right now.
Oh, at least we have that in common for sure.
Right on. All right, well, let's jump into the first question, which is, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about Kula Partners and your role at the company?
Yeah, sure. My name's Carman Pirie, and I co-founded Kula Partners. We are an agency that specializes in maximizing revenue potential for B2B manufacturers. Typically, our clients sell within more complex technical environments, and we help them take a more targeted, account-focused approach to drive revenue growth within those niche categories. So that's a little bit about Kula, and I tend to be the lead strategist in the firm. Although, admittedly, there are many folks that work here that are more active in the day-to-day business than I am from that point of view, and but I do serve as lead counsel to our clients in that regard.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction. So where can people connect with you on the internet?
You know, really the best place is to go to kulapartners.com. That's Kula partners.com. You'll be able to find me there. Sure, I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter as well. But look, Nathan, I'm a bit of an active political guy on Twitter sometimes. I don't really advise, and it's a bit of a non-businessy place for me typically. But if you're really interested in getting in a dust up about local politics here in Halifax, then I suppose by all means,
I might just have to check that out. I'm a big fan of Twitter, and I've always considered it the water bubbler at work equivalent. It's where you have all the juicy bits about what's going on in the world. So I very well may do that.
Well, look, at your own risk.
Fair enough. All right. So third question. Can you tell us a bit about your experience with the packaging industry?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, my first experience in the packaging industry was as a bag boy at a grocery store growing up, but I suppose that's not particularly relevant. More recently, Nathan, over the past number of years, I suppose now coming on maybe 7 or 8 years, we've had flexible packaging manufacturers as clients, and I've advised a wide range of them on a number of issues. Not the least of which is sustainable packaging, and more specifically around the marketing and messaging in that category.
Mm-hmm.
To be clear, I'm sure a lot of people, yourself included, and those listening here, have more experience in the technical aspects of packaging. For me, it's how do you market and message and think about your relationship with the market in the context often of what is really a bit of a sustainability. I'm not going to say crisis within the category, but certainly a challenge.
Yeah, totally. Sustainability is a complicated subject. When I joined my company, my biggest concern was, we're a flexible packaging company. And for people who don't know, I mean, our listeners would, but for clarification for new listeners, flexible packaging is primarily made out of specific types of plastics and metal foils. And I had concerns about that. But what I was shocked to find out is that when you compare plastics to, say, glass or metal containers, both of which are completely recyclable, as it turns out, the carbon footprint is a lot higher for rigid forms of packaging like glass and metal, to the point that the amount of carbon that is produced in the production of those items and the shipping across the US, because glass and metal, for example, are much heavier, actually has more of an impact on the environment due to the carbon footprint. I say that not as like trying to defend plastics, because obviously plastics are a problem. We got them clogging up waterways, the Great Pacific garbage patch. But when it comes down to the full effect, plastics are actually surprisingly more sustainable than some rigid forms of packaging.
Yeah, I mean, Nathan, you make a great point, of course, and there's also arguments to be made in the area of food waste, and how a lot of packaging, of course, helps preserve foods that otherwise wouldn't have nearly as long a shelf life. Cucumbers are often cited as an example of that. Um, but the trouble, I think, Nathan, with those arguments, and it's not that I disagree with them at all, by the way, because I've seen the same science you have, but they're more complex arguments to make, aren't they? It's much easier to demonize the plastic straw. It's much easier to show, if some of the listeners might be old enough to remember the images of ducks with the plastic rings that used to hold like 6 packs of cans, right?
Yep.
And their neck through the ring of the plastic, and therefore, I mean, just that image can really drive a lot of consumer attention, perceptions, behavior, and I think that's the challenge in some ways for the sector is how do we live in this world where the arguments that we try to bring forward are, frankly, a lot more complex than the arguments that we're fighting against. And they suffer a bit from the flaw of ands. Like if you're trying to communicate something, and if you have to say that word "and" too many times, you're going to lose a lot of people. And that's kind of, I think, where we're at.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Front and center when I talk to consumers, whether they're my friends, family, coworkers, whatever, and you talk about sustainability, the first thing that people bring up is recycling and is a product recyclable. And that's problematic in and of itself because the majority of the recycling, at least where we are, I can't speak for your location, but in the USA, the majority of the recycling done here is called single stream recycling. So plastics, glass, metal, paperboard, pretty much anything that is recyclable gets thrown into a single stream recycling bin, and then a waste management company will come and pick it up. Now, that sounds great in theory. And when this first came out, I want to say at least 25 years ago, maybe more. I remember being a kid when or maybe a late teen when the shift came and people started having hoppers at the end of their driveways like I do now. And, everything goes to one place. You don't have to sort it. You don't have to do any work. The problem with that is if you don't, for example, if you have a glass jar, it'll have labels that are stuck to it with adhesive. If the labels and the adhesive are not removed and the jar is not dried from any water droplets or food contaminants and it gets tossed in, that the water and contaminants from that will get on other items in the bin, and any contaminated items will not get recycled. Now, we used to have a solution to that in America where we would take the things that were contaminated and we would sell them to China. But China is no longer buying these contaminated materials from us. So it's a catch-22 when it comes to single-stream recycling.
Oh man, yeah, is it ever? And I have a bit of a potentially unique perspective here in that I advise flexible packaging manufacturers from really across North America. But I live in this little weird part of the world called Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotia was a very early leader in waste diversion, composting, recycling. So we've been at it for a lot longer than most, and no shortage of probably feeling of self-righteousness around it as well. I don't mind saying, but at the same time, it's like we've had to come to terms as a jurisdiction of late that it's not really working. To your point, we used to sell some of that recycled material or material for recycling to the Philippines, etc. And a client actually of ours that happens to have very bright yellow bags as part of their operation ended up seeing their packaging on the top of a heap in the Philippines
Oh
uh,
man.
on the national news,
Uh-oh.
national evening newscast, and they, you know, to their credit, or they were thinking, well, we're these bags are recyclable. We're that's why we use them. We pay extra for that to do that for our customers, and the reality was somewhat different than that. And to your point, we used to think that recycling was the ultimate destination, but of course, in the U.S., I mean, there's just recycling facility. It's just not a widespread availability, and that's in addition to the fact that we've come to realize in other jurisdictions as well that recycling just isn't the end answer. It's not getting us where we need to go. I think most people would be of the view that we need to get to compostable plastics at some point that don't have a level of microplastics associated with it. But that's a destination, not something that where we're at yet.
I totally agree with that. And that sort of segues nicely into the next question, which is how have you seen the conversation around sustainable packaging change in recent years?
Yeah, well, it's really that, isn't it? I mean, it's changed from recycling to biodegradable plastics, and then of course that's had its challenges as well. So I do feel like the category has gotten its head around the fact that recycling probably isn't the end destination. The other way that the conversation is changing around sustainable packaging is that jurisdictions are getting tired of waiting. We see I think, look, we're recording this on March the 3rd, and I believe it's tomorrow. Is it tomorrow or is it in May the 4th? I don't know if it's March or May 4th when.
May the 4th.
Is it May the 4th when New Jersey is bringing out their bag ban? And this is several months after France announced that they were phasing out single-use plastics, and they're looking to get rid of all single-use plastics by 2040. So where it used to be that I felt like you had this stalemate, if you will, within the packaging industry, where you had the flexible packaging manufacturers saying, well, we can only move so fast because these more environmentally progressive options are more expensive, and our customers aren't willing to pay for them. And then you had the brands saying, well, our customers aren't really demanding this yet, or they're not willing to pay the extra cost at the checkout.
Right.
And it was all happening like it was like everybody's pointing fingers to somebody else to move first. And now we're seeing that the jurisdictions are moving.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that both here in the U.S. and by keeping an eye on international news when it comes to this, because, I mean, pretty much every country that I'm aware of, and I'm not a expert when it comes to geography, but it does seem like this is a conversation that is happening practically everywhere. And I got to back up. I said May the 4th was the correct date. I want to apologize to our listeners. I don't know if that's correct in regards to the New Jersey statement. I'm a huge Star Wars nerd, and we have a thing here in the U.S. called May the 4th be with you. So I thought you were making a Star Wars joke. I apologize about that.
No. My girlfriend would be the one that would make a Star Wars joke. I'm completely ill-equipped.
Fair enough. All right, well, why don't we move on from there to the next question, which is, what do you think is the biggest challenge standing in the way of a more sustainable packaging future?
I don't want to recycle the answer, but I think it's just what we were just talking about. That's the biggest challenge standing in the way is that we still, as an industry, haven't entered into a collaborative relationship to move towards a fully sustainable packaging future. We're still looking to pass the buck so that we can make some money along the way. And I think that window is closing. Really, it's kind of, I was thinking about this in the lead up to coming on to today's show, and I was like, it's interesting to me for flexible packaging manufacturers because they kind of have a choice at some point Are you going to be part of the solution, or are you going to be replaced? We see that with automobile manufacturers. Sure, some of them are building electric cars now, and they're all moving in that direction, but they lost that first mover status and category leadership to Tesla, because they were, I think, in some ways, trying to have their cake and eat it too. And I wonder how many parallels there are for our flexible packaging friends.
I totally agree with everything you said, and I want to back up. About 5 minutes ago, you had mentioned biodegradable packaging, which, when it first hit the scene, I thought, "Here's the solution. This is it." There are bio-based packaging that are made out of non-synthetic polymers, so they're still technically plastics, but the genetic makeup, for lack of a better term, is actually from rice compounds or various plant-based items, and that's exciting. When it first came out, I was like, "Oh man, this is great! This is the answer. This is what we need to shift to." And here at Industrial Packaging, we do have some access to these materials, but you also mentioned passing the buck. It unfortunately does seem to come down to money. Somebody somewhere is going to have to make a sacrifice, and for the most part, it doesn't seem like corporations are particularly enthralled to be the ones to first do that. So, does it come down to being a consumer? Is it an individual thing that we, as consumers who buy stuff at the supermarket or the department store or Amazon, is it us who needs to take it? And I think the answer is both. And that's an uncomfortable thing, because when you really look at the world and you see the negative impacts that all types of packaging has, whether it's recyclable or not, for me personally, it comes down to being like, okay, I'm part of the problem. I need to fix this. And it's frustrating because if I'm doing it, my neighbor's not. It's easy to fall into that trap of, well, everyone else isn't doing it, so why should I? And I think that's something that needs to be focused on. And it's interesting that you bring up Tesla, because there was such a craze when they came out with the first electric car. I believe it was them who came out with the first, at least the first publicly available. It's not really a solution, is it?
What really isn't a solution?
Well, like electric cars, is that a solution? Bio-based. Let's go back, I guess, to bio-based.
I don't know. It's interesting parallel, of course, because electric cars, you would have in some ways a similar argument. If you're producing electricity by burning coal, and then you take that electricity and charge your car up, how much better is that than powering your car by gasoline?
Exactly. That's the direction I was going for.
But from a marketing and communications perspective, these types of arguments don't matter, because the market decides in a way that's more simplistic than that. Like, the market isn't interested in hearing the conversation about whether or not you're producing your electricity with coal and then you're powering the car. It's like, no, electric cars are better than gas guzzling cars. It's the fact. And it's widely seen, and we see across a wide number of jurisdictions where now we have mandates that vehicles that aren't electric aren't going to be able to be sold after 2025 or 2030. Is that coming to America in the next couple of years? Probably not. But that global shift will not avoid America either.
I think that's very true, and that brings us to the next question. We're kind of already talking about it, but I guess just to keep the conversation going, and I don't. If you don't have an answer to this, that's fine. But how do we address the stalemate? I know that when I think about it, I've come up with ideas and been like, yeah, this is it. But then when you look into the deeper repercussions, let's take biodegradable packaging, for example. One of the things I learned in the past couple of years working here at Industrial Packaging is that bio-based packaging, you can't just take it and throw it on the side of the road or the woods and have it biodegrade. The majority of biodegradable packaging that is currently available on the market has to either be put into a compost pile at home, which is, it's not rocket science, but how many people are actually going to do it? Or if you're lucky enough to live in a town like Cambridge, Massachusetts is about 45 minutes from where I live. They have an industrial composting facility, and what they do is everybody throws all their food particles into a bin. They pick it up, they bring it to this facility, and they mass produce loam and mulch from the compost, and then sell it to home and garden centers. So I feel like that's moving in the right direction, but it still comes back to personal accountability and responsibility, because if you buy bio-based packaging and you're a litter bug, that's not really solving the issue. And if it ends up in the landfill because it's inside of a plastic bag, which I believe takes on average 1,000 years to biodegrade, it's not going to biodegrade properly.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no question that the solution I don't think exists yet. I don't think we've found the answer. What I think part of the way of getting there, however, is for people to be more, I would say, to lean into the collaborative conversation more. I don't see a lot of truly open partnerships between flexible packaging manufacturers and their brands. I see sales conversations, and I see content being produced about sustainable packaging and being offered up for download on a website or what have you. But are the salespeople leading the conversations with how do we move towards a sustainable packaging future? No, the salespeople are looking to sell. And to your point, if there's price pressure, then that changes the game and changes the equation. So I feel like in some way the answer is for flexible packaging manufacturers and the brands that they serve to actually start talking about it together rather than separate, if you will.
I think that's a fantastic response. I like the idea of how you said, are the salesmen thinking or talking about this? And largely, I think the answer is no. That's a great point. I think sales professionals and people who work in corporate America and like corporations in general who sell and produce these products do need to start having these conversations. I'm hoping that this podcast, our listeners out there, because many of them work for manufacturing companies, maybe this will be the spark that lights the flame. I mean, one can hope, right? But basically. Go on.
Well, one of the interesting things is, to my earlier point around the jurisdictional shifts that we're seeing, I would hope that people would actually have that on their environmental scan as well, to say, you know what? It's only a matter of time before what we're seeing in France, we're going to see here. And you can't. And by the way, it's not like France is going to stand still. They're going to get more and more progressive on that front. As I think we're nearing a point where people have to be looking at the regulatory trajectory that's happening globally, looking at the science and development behind new options, and they need to make a decision at some point: am I part of the solution or am I part of the problem? And it doesn't mean that you have to stop completely doing what you're doing now. I'm not trying to demonize people. I think it's a lot easier to make change from inside the industry than from outside in some ways. So we need well-intended people who see themselves as part of the solution and are willing to migrate their operations to get there.
100% agree. And I think that does go both for corporations and individuals. The way I think of it is there's two different types of billionaires in the world. There's the guy who becomes Batman and attempts to save the world, and there's the guy who becomes Lex Luthor and wants to destroy it. So as an individual consumer and any billionaires listening to the show, which one do you want to be? I know I'd like to be Batman. Do I have an answer on how to solve these problems? No, I really don't. And unlike most consumers, I've put a lot of thought into it. I've been, I would say, an environmentalist since I was 6 years old. I've been very fond of the natural world, particularly the ocean. I try to get there at least a couple weeks a year. And, when I go fishing or hiking, I see blister packs or various types of plastic packaging. I mean, fishing spots are one of the worst. A lot of the plastic waste in the oceans is actually industrial fishing supplies. And even at my local rivers, when I go to my spots, someone is always leaving a plastic container behind or a styrofoam cup in which they keep the worms in. Now, it's simple to, bring out what you brought in. And I think it starts as a grassroots thing on that. It really ultimately probably comes down to consumers first. But we need, I think, corporate buy-in, at, the upper echelons, the C-level executives of the companies who are, producing this stuff. And it's going to have to be a mutual conversation between each of us as individuals and the powers that be to find a solution to these problems.
I'm not overly optimistic if we if we put it onto the consumer fully. However, I just want to just mention that. Like, I know that it's easy to talk about individual responsibility and people recycling or not, et cetera. And to your point, I mean, as you said it, the kind of, if you will, the extent to which people comply with that or don't will change. And if there's not 100% compliance, so then it causes problems. I think when you look at, say, maybe jurisdictions like Amsterdam, they've figured out that, you really can't trust the consumer to separate waste at source. So, for instance, and I may be dramatically oversimplifying how their system works, but it's a type of incineration that captures all of the byproducts that are in it. So you capture the iron that's in all of this garbage and the other and anything that can be repurposed or reused, but it's captured kind of post-incineration, not sorted beforehand. They put everything into one big bin there, because so I think it's interesting to think about that as at least maybe an interim solution, but also through the lens of, how a jurisdiction that, by the way, has a much stronger social contract than the U.S. does. I mean, the Netherlands, as a society, has a much stronger social contract than the U.S. for sure. So they're more likely to get compliance on rules, as an example, from their citizens, and even they've realized that they're not going to get it.
Yeah, everything you said is, from my perspective, 100% truth. And, your commentary pretty much answered the last question, which was, what would you like to see in sustainable packaging in the future as a consumer? But with that being said, is there anything you would like to add before the end of our episode today?
I don't have anything especially to add. I just say, look, if you're a brand that's listening to this, or another flexible packaging manufacturer, I think that there's I think that the category is really interested in having leading voices on this. But I don't think it's about necessarily just about a marketing message or what you say externally, because I think in many ways people all say the same thing when it comes to sustainability. I think the more important thing is what they're almost doing behind the scenes between the packaging manufacturers themselves and the brands. I think that's where we're going to start to see some progress. And what I see maybe a little too much in the category is sugarcoating the front end of it, and that often falls on deaf ears to consumers who are again more susceptible to the more simplistic messages around, for instance, plastic straws. So, but Nathan, this has been a really a pleasure to chat with you today.
Oh, I agree. I will certainly be having you back in the future sometime if you're willing to come on. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Carman.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for another episode of the Industrial Packaging Podcast with me, your host, Nathan Dube, Digital Marketing Specialist at Industrial Packaging. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you'll tune in for the next one. But until then, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.